Hey everyone, welcome back to the second lesson in our study of the book of Daniel. Last week we considered an overview of the book of Daniel where we looked at the structure of Daniel, we looked at what is Daniel about, who is Daniel, when can we expect these prophecies to be fulfilled, and why should we study Daniel. In today's lesson, we will examine chapter 2, where Nebuchadnezzar has a magnificent dream that Daniel interprets for him, of course with the help of God. But this dream was not only important to King Nebuchadnezzar, but it's important to us today. We're going to be able to pinpoint our time on the timeline of all of human history as it refers to history past and how we are relative to the soon coming of Christ. So let's go ahead and get started with our study. As always, you can find these notes in the description box below the video. Feel free to print those and share them with whoever, with your study groups. And also, please feel free to share the video. So, chapter 2, we're going to learn about Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We're going to start by reading Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. And I'm just reading out of the King James Version from the Bible Hub website. Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. Then the king commanded to call the magicians, and the astrologers, and the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, The thing is gone from me. If ye will not make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut to pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. But if ye show the dream and the interpretation thereof, ye shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. They answered again and said, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation thereof. The king answered and said, I know of a certainty that ye would gain the time, because ye see the thing is gone from me. But if ye will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you. For ye have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me, till the time be changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall show you the interpretation thereof. The Chaldeans answered before the king and said, There is not a man on earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore, there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asks such things of any magician or astrologer or Chaldean. And it is a rare thing that the king requireth, and there is none that can show it before the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. So this begins the story of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2, and the story heats up very quickly. Nebuchadnezzar's spirit is disturbed because of this unsettling dream. So he calls upon his counselors for help. These are called magicians, which we talked about last week. If we shorten the word magicians, we get the word magi. Daniel's influence on the magi very likely instructed the magi at the time of Jesus how to understand the signs in heaven that pointed them to Jesus, born King of the Jews in Bethlehem. So these are his advisors, the magicians, the astrologers. They're also called sorcerers or Chaldeans. These are the wise men that Nebuchadnezzar calls upon to interpret his dream. Now, the nature of the people that he calls upon reveals the culture of Babylon. Babylon was a polytheistic pagan culture. Its roots go all the way back to Nimrod in Genesis chapter 10. And of course, Babylon has its roots in the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. So this is a culture full of idolatry, full of pagan worship, or full of other god worship, little g god worship, and these are Nebuchadnezzar's counselors. Notice in verse 4 that the wise men respond to King Nebuchadnezzar in Syriac, or at least that's what the King James Version calls it. Other translations of the Bible say that they responded to him in Aramaic. Now, this is important to recognize because last week, as we were studying the overall structure of Daniel as a double chiasm, where essentially Daniel is divided into two parts. The first half primarily is written in Aramaic, and the second half primarily is written in Hebrew. The first half includes Daniel chapter 2. So starting in chapter 2, verse 4, begins the Aramaic portion of the text. Now keep in mind, this is the original writing of Daniel that was recorded in Aramaic. The prophecies which ensue not only from Nebuchadnezzar's dream, but Daniel's vision really relate to Gentile kingdoms of the world and Israel's struggle with those Gentile kingdoms. And Aramaic at the time was the language of the Gentiles. So the structure of Daniel also reveals the greater meaning or the interpretation that a lot of these prophecies have to do with Gentile kingdoms of the world. Now, the Magi, astrologers, sorcerers, the Chaldeans, they ask Nebuchadnezzar a very reasonable question. They say, if you want us to interpret the dream, well, what was the dream? Nebuchadnezzar reveals that the dream had gone from him. So either he can't remember his dream, but the weight of the experience of the dream was so important that he presses his wise man for the interpretation, or he's testing them. He wants to know, do they really have divine connections as they claim to do? If you are a sorcerer, you are claiming to have connection to the little g gods. So Nebuchadnezzar demands the interpretation, but he does not tell them what the dream is. Now, incentives for this demand: if the wise men fail to recount Nebuchadnezzar's dream and give him the interpretation, the result will be their death. He will turn their houses into rubble. He will turn them into dunghills, as the King James Version describes, and he will tear them to pieces. Now, if they are successful in their interpretation, this will be accompanied with great reward and honor. In his response, we see that King Nebuchadnezzar is very temperamental. He is in a moment full of wrath and rage, but he's also very powerful. He has the ability to reward the interpreter with position, with material goods, with honor. Yet again, on the other side, he's merciless and ruthless. If we read Daniel's own description of King Nebuchadnezzar from Daniel chapter 5, verse 19, Daniel's talking to one of King Nebuchadnezzar's successors, and he says, "And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he slew, and whom he would, he kept alive. And whom he would, he set up, and whom he would, he put down." So all of this is within Nebuchadnezzar's power. And this causes the people, including his counselors, to fear before him. Now, when the wise men respond to King Nebuchadnezzar, they admit that no man can do what Nebuchadnezzar has asked. No man, no sorcerer, no enchanter, no astrologer can do this impossible task that Nebuchadnezzar has set before them. Yet Nebuchadnezzar is holding them accountable for their position. Do they have insight? Do they really have connections with the divine? Now, we understand that they don't have connections with the one true God, but they themselves were claiming to have special wisdom. So Nebuchadnezzar is holding them accountable for this and testing them in this. Now, the interpreters were unable to recount the dream or give any kind of meaning to Nebuchadnezzar's dream, so he becomes very angry and he threatens them with death. In fact, he does not only threaten the wise men in his presence with death, but all the wise men associated with their kind, he has decided to put to death. This affects Daniel and his three friends who were in Babylon. If you'll recall from chapter 1, Daniel and his three friends had completed a 3-year program where they were immersed in the culture of Babylon. They were studying literature, science, astrology, the language, and they had graduated from this program at the top of their class. Nebuchadnezzar had promoted them to be servants in his presence because they excelled all of the others. They were 10 times better than even the Chaldeans that had been part of this program. So Nebuchadnezzar, because he associates Daniel and his friends with this group of wise men, includes them in this devastating edict that all of the wise men are to be put to death and their houses were to become rubble. So, as I mentioned before, the story heats up very quickly. Let's go back to Daniel chapter 4, Daniel chapter 2, and read verses 13, oops, wrong chapter here. Let me flip over to chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2. Let's continue reading verses 14 to 23. Then Daniel answered with counsel and wisdom to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree so hasty from the king?" Then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. Then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time and that he would show the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who hast given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me now what we desired of thee. For thou now hast made known unto us the king's matter." So Daniel's character is revealed in his response to this very harsh decree. If you found out that someone else at work had failed to complete a project and now your job was on the line and you were going to be fired because of their failure, you would probably not respond with as much calmness and tact that Daniel responds with. Daniel is not reactive. He answers with patience, respect, and tact. In fact, he uses his demeanor to pacify Arioch, the one who had delivered the message of bad news. In verse 16, we see Daniel go directly to the source. He approaches King Nebuchadnezzar and he respectfully requests time, and he assures him that he can give him the interpretation. So he's full of confidence. Now, Daniel goes back to his friends and has an immediate prayer meeting. We can learn from Daniel here in this very difficult situation where his life was on the line, that our first defense, like Daniel's, is prayer. So Daniel calls his friends, they pray to the Lord, and the Lord reveals to them the secret. Daniel receives understanding of this dream in a night vision. Now, we don't really know if that's a dream or if this is a waking vision, but the Bible says the secret was revealed to him in a night vision. Daniel responds with praise and thanksgiving. He says, "Blessed be God forever and ever. Wisdom and might are his." So he credits God for the wisdom, for the understanding, for the insight that he has been given. Daniel knows that it's nothing special within him that allows him to be able to interpret this dream. He understands that the wisdom he has is a gift from God. Daniel comments that God is the sovereign ruler over times, that he sets up and changes kingdoms. This is probably a reference to the content of the dream. We're going to see in a moment that the dream was about the successive gentile kingdoms of the world. And so Daniel is praising God for that. God is sovereign. He's the one that changes times and kingdoms. In fact, in verse 22, Daniel says that God reveals the deep and secret things. And for that, Daniel gives God much praise and thanksgiving. So let's continue reading in Daniel chapter 2, verses 24 through 30. Daniel interprets the dream. Therefore Daniel went in unto Arioch, whom the king had ordained to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus unto him, "Destroy not the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show unto the king the interpretation." Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus unto him, "I have found a man of the captives of Judah that will make known unto the king the interpretation." The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, "Art thou able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen, and the interpretation thereof?" Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, "The secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king. But There is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter. And he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. But as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes, that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. So Daniel was successful, and he approaches King Nebuchadnezzar with confidence, with patience, with respect for God. And when Daniel responds to King Nebuchadnezzar, he not only credits God, but he simultaneously discredits the Magi and the astrologers. Daniel echoes their sentiments and says the wise men, the astrologers, and the magicians and the soothsayers, they have been unable to perform the task that King Nebuchadnezzar has demanded of them. But in specifically verse 28, Daniel says there is a God in heaven who can reveal the secrets. Several times in chapter 2 here, God is referred to as the revealer of secrets. He reveals the things that are to come to pass in the latter days. In Daniel, God is revealing very important secrets, and these revelations are connected to the revelation, the book of Revelation written by the beloved disciple John. And we know that many of these prophecies given in Daniel overlap with what happens in the book of Revelation. If we read Psalm 103:19, it reiterates the fact that God is sovereign over all. In verse 19, it says, the Lord has established his throne in heaven, and his kingdom rules over all. So this is the lesson that God is giving to King Nebuchadnezzar. The power, the position, the kingdom that King Nebuchadnezzar has comes only from God, because God is the source of times and seasons and all power. And because of that, Nebuchadnezzar was given this dream and the interpretation through Daniel that he could understand that God rules over all. It's going to take a while for King Nebuchadnezzar to learn that lesson, as we'll see in chapter 4. Now, let's continue reading in Daniel chapter 2, the revelation of the dream. Daniel chapter 2, let's read verses 31 to 35. Here's where it starts getting really exciting. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Now, just imagine Nebuchadnezzar. He had forgotten his dream. And here Daniel recounts the dream in great detail for King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar very likely instantly trusted Daniel and the interpretation that was to follow, because he was able to reveal something that came from within himself. He was able to recount his dream without having known the dream. The dream is about an image or a statue. This is a great metal man that King Nebuchadnezzar has dreamed about. This image actually reflects what it represents. We're going to see that this represents the succession of Gentile kingdoms on the earth over time. The rock that was not cut out by hands comes and destroys this statue. This great metal image of a man is broken to chaff. It's literally ground to dust and blows away as if it never was. It's destroyed by a rock, and this rock grows to a great mountain. So the rock not only destroys the statue, but it replaces the statue. Now, the description of the statue was given in Daniel's recounting of the dream. The head is made of gold, and we go through the metals all the way down to the feet and 10 toes, which were made of iron mixed with clay. So the value of the metals descend or decrease in value as we descend the statue. As we're going to see, each of these pieces of the statue represents successive Gentile kingdoms, and we're going to see that in the nature of these kingdoms as well. They decrease in value from gold to clay, and we're going to see the kingdoms fade in glory as time passes on. If you think about the nature of those metals, gold is a very pliable metal, whereas iron is a very strong metal. We can see these materials increasing in strength from gold to iron. So we will see the kingdoms that they represent also become more powerful and more oppressive as time goes on. So the Gentile successive kingdoms that were ruling over the land of Israel fade in glory, yet become more oppressive over time. So Daniel was successful in his recounting of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, definitely winning Nebuchadnezzar's respect, and Nebuchadnezzar very likely trusted the interpretation that was to come. So let's read the interpretation of the dream. This is in Daniel chapter 2, verses 36 through 45. We read, "This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of heaven, that he hath given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. And after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of iron. For as much as thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, and as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave to one another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. And the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof is sure." So Daniel gives the interpretation or the meaning of not only the statue, but the individual components of the statue. Daniel is careful to reiterate to King Nebuchadnezzar that it is God who gives him the power and his kingdom. We have to remember that King Nebuchadnezzar was the ruler of the enemy, the great enemy of the southern kingdom of Judah. King Nebuchadnezzar had besieged Jerusalem. He had carried much of the population off in captivity to his own land, taking them out of the palace, taking them out of the land of Israel, out of Jerusalem. And he had destroyed their greatest treasure, the temple which stood on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So King Nebuchadnezzar is the great enemy of Israel and the people of God. And here, Daniel, a Jew, is giving him the correct interpretation, and he's reminding him the power that you have comes from God above. Now, Daniel only officially interprets the head of gold and names that particular portion or names that interpretation. But we can understand who the successive kingdoms were because we can look back in history and trace Gentile history. So let's go through the statue. Here's a quick picture of the statue. If you want to get a visual, looking at the left, Daniel chapter 2, there is a head of gold, chest and arms of silver. The two arms are important to recognize there. Belly and thighs of brass or bronze, legs of iron, feet and toes made of iron mixed with clay. And we do want to observe that there are 10 toes there. That's important for the interpretation. As we're going to see, this particular chapter relates to the prophecies or the vision of Daniel in Daniel chapter 7. Tonight, we're focusing on the specifics of Daniel chapter 2. If we go back and refer to our double chiastic structure here, Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7 are in parallel positions. So those two prophecies relate to each other. So the head is made of gold, and Daniel indicates that the head of gold is King Nebuchadnezzar himself. He says, "Thou art that head of gold." King Nebuchadnezzar was the singular ruler over the kingdom of Babylon. So we can say the head of gold points singularly to King Nebuchadnezzar himself, but it also refers collectively to his kingdom of Babylon. In that passage, Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, "You are a king of kings." It's ironic to think about Daniel calling Nebuchadnezzar the king of kings because recall, Nebuchadnezzar is the king of the enemy of Israel. The King of Kings is a title that's reserved for Jesus Christ in the book of Revelation. So here, the head of gold represents King Nebuchadnezzar singularly and his kingdom of Babylon collectively. Now, as we descend the statue, we next come to the chest and arms of silver. Notice that there are two arms, a left arm and a right arm. And in general, the right arm is stronger than the left arm. That's significant to the interpretation. Daniel simply says that there will be a kingdom that arises after Babylon that is inferior to Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. He does not name which kingdom this is. But based on later events that happen in the book of Daniel, we're actually going to see this regime change. One empire comes in and overtakes another. And we know that it was the Medes and the Persians that took over Babylon. So the chest and arms of silver represent that Medo-Persian kingdom. One was stronger than the other, just like the right arm is stronger than the left arm. So the silver kingdom is made of two arms. It is composed of two peoples, the Medes and the Persians. Continue working our way down the statue. Next, we have the belly and thighs of brass or bronze. We can determine that this points to the kingdom of Greece. Later in the book of Daniel, Daniel is going to refer to the prince of Grecia. He refers to the prince of Persia and he refers to the prince of Grecia. In Daniel chapter 10, Daniel's receiving information from the angel Gabriel, who comes with very important messages for Daniel. And Gabriel says that he was detained by the prince of Persia, and when he leaves, the prince of Grecia will come. Now, these princes that Gabriel is struggling with are not human princes of the visible political kingdoms on the earth. They are spiritual entities working behind the scenes of these earthly kingdoms. They are princes in the angelic realm. But the prince of Persia is mentioned, the prince of Grecia is mentioned. So we can follow the succession of these kingdoms and add interpretation to Daniel's interpretation. Daniel just simply says these are successive kingdoms. We can identify the belly and thighs as pointing to Greece. Daniel chapter 7 will also inform our interpretation a little bit later on. Working our way down this statue, next we come to the legs. The legs are a little bit longer. They are composed of iron, and we have to recognize there's a left leg and a right leg. So the kingdom that succeeded Greece, of course, is the kingdom of Rome. This would have been the kingdom that was in power when Jesus was on the earth in the flesh during New Testament times. The kingdom of Rome was involved in the arrest and punishment and crucifixion of Jesus. And so these are the legs of iron. Rome had an eastern leg and a western leg. So even the anatomy of the statue lends interpretation. Finally, after the feet of iron mixed with clay, we arrive at the bottom of the statue. These are composed of iron and clay. And also, we recognize that there is a partition into 10 toes. The feet of iron mixed with clay is very challenging. We have to figure out which kingdom this was. This kingdom will come after the kingdom of Rome, and we know that Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome are all history. So to figure out which kingdom is represented by the feet and the 10 toes, we can safely say it's going to be the last kingdom that occurs before that rock not cut out with human hands comes in and destroys all of these Gentile kingdoms. Now, if we look at these ancient world empires that have been described by this statue, descending in value, ascending in strength, the statue starts with the Babylonian Empire. It's succeeded by the Medo-Persian Empire, followed by the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire. If you examine these maps, these all govern generally the same area, but specifically over the land of Israel. The Bible is Israel-centric, and so there are other great kingdoms of the world, but the ones that the Bible is referring to are those that relate to the nation of Israel. Now, following the Roman Empire did have several phases, but we know directly after the Roman Empire, we can trace the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire. This was a very long-lasting empire, and in fact, it lasted up through 1923. It was dissolved after World War I in 1923. And then the main power of the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, became a republic in 1924. It's important to consider the Ottoman Empire as a possible interpretation of the feet of iron mixed with clay. I know that there are several who teach that the legs of iron, which descend into the feet of iron mixed with clay, the feet of iron mixed with clay, are a revived Roman Empire. Keep in mind, there's two different popular interpretations out there. The feet of iron mixed with clay may represent a revived Roman Empire. Many teach that it's centered in Europe. Others, such as Joel Richardson, for example, teach that the feet of iron mixed with clay represent a Middle Eastern kingdom related to the Islamic Empire or the Ottoman Empire of the past. I tend towards the Middle Eastern interpretation of things as opposed to the European interpretation because passages such as Ezekiel 38, understanding where the Antichrist comes from, his pursuits as far as direction and land go, it's all Middle Eastern. Another thing that's important to consider is that the 7 churches in the book of Revelation are all located in modern day Turkey. They are ancient cities with locations in what is now modern day Turkey. And of course, Turkey at this time, the leader of Turkey has been talking about reviving the Islamic Caliphate. And what we see in the feet of iron mixed with clay, the remnants of Rome, yet a new substance, the clay. So all of those things are important to keep in mind as we study the feet of iron mixed with clay. In Daniel 2:43, it's very interesting. It says, "They shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but as the iron doesn't mix with clay, they shall not cleave to one another." So how do we interpret that? What exactly is that describing about this kingdom? Well, I've heard many speakers talk about how because of the tumultuous situation in a lot of the Islamic nations and all of the refugees that have been spreading around the earth, that particular nation is mingling through intermarriage with all of the nations on the earth. We could also consider maybe it's representing something a little bit more sinister. They shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. Well, if we think about what is the seed of men, that's referring to DNA. Is there some sort of mixture that goes on with human DNA, such as the situation that we read about in Genesis 6, where the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and they had children by them. And those children become the Nephilim, the giants on the earth, who have that antichrist character, that anti-Israel, that enemy, proud and boastful mouth. So that is included in the description of the feet of iron mixed with clay. Another important thing to recognize about the feet is it does divide into 10 toes. Those 10 toes are 10 end time kings or kingdoms that are unified in this last days kingdom of iron mixed with clay. So keep in mind, it's important to consider, or at least keep a possibility that that last end time kingdom may be a revived Islamic caliphate. Now, the good news about this vision that Daniel has is that all of these Gentile kingdoms are done away with at once together in a moment by the rock that's not cut out by human hands. The fact that this is rock shows that it is something natural, but it is not cut out by human hands. This is not a Gentile human kingdom on the earth. This is the millennial kingdom of Christ. Now, just as Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, and Rome were all visible, physical, political kingdoms on the earth, we have to remember that Jesus will be returning to the earth to set up his kingdom, which will be visible, physical, political, and on the earth. This kingdom is described in many places of the Old Testament, but specifically it's the 1,000-year millennial kingdom that's described in the book of Revelation. So it's really fascinating whenever we look at this ancient king's dream of this great metal statue and how it tells the story of successive Gentile kingdoms. You know, if we learned it like this in school, we would have probably remembered our history a little bit better, right? But what's important about this is we can pinpoint our location. If we imagine this metal statue to be a timeline and time is ticking forward through history up to our current time, we can pinpoint our location on this timeline. We are either maybe here and maybe we're just before the 10 toes. That's important to recognize. What's not on this diagram is the rock that's not cut out with human hands. Once that last kingdom is completed, the rock will be here. So we have concrete information that we are in the last days and we are in the times that are just before the return of Christ to the earth. So thinking of the statue as a timeline, we can pinpoint our location. We're in the feet. We're still waiting on those 10 toes. And when that is completed, the rock will be here. So Jesus will be returning soon. If you are new to the Bible or you're unfamiliar with this information, it's important to consider, where are you in your relationship with God? Have you been saved? Have you considered the importance of that part of your life? The Bible says that anyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. When you recognize that you are a sinner and you need a savior and you are unable to clean up your life and to make things right, that you're guilty of sin, all it takes is a turning away, turning and facing towards God, crying out to him, looking to Jesus. He's the only means of salvation. He has paid the penalty for sin on the cross, and he died and rose again in our place. And because he has ascended, he has promised that he will raise us to life again as well. Romans 10:9 says that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So it's that belief, it's that turning towards God and looking to him for salvation that grants you that saving faith. So it's a very exciting dream from a very ancient man. Now, we have to remember this rock smashes all of these kingdoms to dust simultaneously. So when Jesus returns and sets up his kingdom, it's not going to look anything like what we've seen before. It's going to be new, it's going to be unique, and it's going to be singular. Now, this statue is destroyed by the rock not cut out with human hands. We can imagine that rock coming in and smashing the statue, and the statue is just blown to bits and it blows away like it was never there. This imagery is consistent with the story of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel 17. If we look at David, David was a shepherd boy. He was a foreshadow of Jesus, chosen from among his brothers, rejected by his brothers, struggled with King Saul, but eventually raised to become the king of Israel. David is a clear foreshadow of Christ. He faces this giant Goliath, and if you'll remember, David gets 5 smooth stones from the river, and he takes out this giant with one stone, one natural stone that came from the river, and he hits Goliath between the eyes, in the forehead. Goliath falls flat in a position of honor, right, or a position of worship, um, illustrating his defeat. He's taken down by a rock. Giant Goliath hit by a rock, falling into a prostrate position, is the same imagery that we have here of this metal statue being crushed by the rock, not cut out with human hands. So Jesus will ultimately have the victory, just like David had the victory over Goliath. Now, again, Daniel only specifically tells us that the head of gold represents Babylon, and he indicates that the later parts of the statue will be successive kingdoms. But we're going to get more information about these kingdoms through Daniel's visions in chapter 7 and also from the book of Revelation. If you're ready to start looking forward and thinking about a deeper interpretation, we can go to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel's going to have a vision of 4 beasts, and his 4th beast, as we're going to see, will correspond to these last kingdoms in line on the statue. The 4th beast has 10 horns. These 10 horns will correspond to the 10 toes of Nebuchadnezzar's statue. We're going to read that among these 10 horns, there comes up another little horn. We're not told that detail about the toes, right? There comes up another little horn amongst these 10 horns. In this little horn were eyes like the eyes of a man and a mouth speaking great things. We'll learn that that's a picture of the Antichrist. His mouth speaking great things reminds us of Goliath bragging and boasting in front of the nation of Israel. We'll also learn a little bit more about these kingdoms in the book of Revelation, specifically Revelation 17. The scarlet beast is described that has 7 heads and 10 horns. The 10 horns of the scarlet beast correspond to the 10 horns of Daniel's 4th beast and the 10 toes of the kingdom that we're studying. Verse 8 in chapter 17 of Revelation says, "The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit." So here we're hearing about resurrection, and we can see that the legs of iron continue down into the feet of iron mixed with clay. Behold, the beast that was and is not and yet is. Another reason we could consider that feet of iron mixed with clay represents a revived Islamic caliphate is because, once again, it was dissolved in 1923, but there's talk of reviving it again. That would be consistent with the prophecies in Revelation. The 7 heads of the scarlet beast in the book of Revelation are 7 mountains or places of power. And verse 10 tells us they are also 7 kings. 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. So the 7 heads are mountains or kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. So they're talking about 7 kings, but we didn't quite have that many. So if we back up our interpretation a little bit and we compare Daniel's statue with the 7 heads of the scarlet beast in the book of Revelation, we can identify 7 world powers that have specifically ruled over the nation of Israel. They are Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and of course, the last kingdom. In that passage in Revelation, it said 5 have fallen. So at the time that John received this information, 5 had fallen. 1 is, so at the time that John wrote Revelation, the kingdom of Rome was in power, and 1 has not yet come. So we can see how that interpretation is consistent with our statue. The beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th and is of the 7. So if we're talking about a kingdom that was, now is not, yet is, it is the 7th, yet it is the 8th. Verse 12, the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but will receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. So the 10 toes have a short-lived reign on the earth, and they will be united with this last end times kingdom. Now, let's talk for a few minutes more about the millennial rock kingdom. We know that that statue representing successive Gentile kingdoms is destroyed by the rock. Throughout the Bible, Jesus is consistently represented by a rock or a stone. This is both from the Old Testament and from the New Testament. If we go to Genesis chapter 49, verse 24, Jacob is blessing his children. When he blesses Joseph, he refers to the mighty God of Jacob and equates him with the shepherd or the stone of Israel. So Jacob himself, Israel himself, equates the mighty God of Jacob with the shepherd and the stone of Israel. Psalm 118 is very popular and familiar to you, I'm sure. It says, the stone which the builders refused is become the headstone of the corner. This is in the book of Psalms, originally written there, but in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts, Jesus, the writers, Paul himself, they all interpret the stone which the builders refused, which becomes the headstone of the corner. They interpret that to be Jesus himself. Jesus identified himself as the stone which the builders had rejected and the headstone of the corner. In Isaiah 8:14, he writes about a stone of stumbling and a rock for offense. The stone and the rock both represent Jesus Christ. If we look at the New Testament, which is really just a commentary of the Old Testament, in Matthew, in Romans, in First Peter, the verses are given there specifically, they interpret that stone of stumbling and that rock of offense to be Jesus. So Jesus is the stone which the builders rejected. He's the headstone of the corner. He's the stone of stumbling and the rock of offense. Isaiah writes again in chapter 28, verse 16, I lay in Zion for a foundation, a stone, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. He that believeth shall not make haste. If we read 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, 1 Peter, that is interpreted to be Christ. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 11, Paul is talking about the believer's rewards. Remember, he says, you're going to build on something. It may be wood, hay, stubble. It may be gold, silver, precious stones, but you have to build on the foundation, which is Christ. So Paul interprets this foundation stone, the tried stone, the precious cornerstone, the sure foundation, to be Christ. So very consistently, the stone represents Christ. 1 Corinthians 10:4, Paul is writing about Israel's experience in the wilderness. He says they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and here it is, that rock was Christ. Okay, that is an identity. If I were to write that as an equation, I would say rock with a capital R equals Christ. That rock was Christ. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 8, Peter's really done his homework here. He's not only going to quote Isaiah, but he's also going to quote Psalms, and he's going to put it all together for us. Peter says that Jesus is the living stone. He quotes Isaiah and says, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone. He says the stone the builders disallowed, the same is made the head of the corner. Notice there, he's quoting Psalm 118. And then he goes on in verse 8, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. There he's quoting Isaiah. So Peter, whose name means rock, is writing about the living stone, the chief cornerstone, the stone the builders disallowed, the head of the corner. the stone of stumbling, the rock of offense. Peter the rock is saying this is Jesus. So the stone, the rock, the foundation, all of those represent Jesus. So, what does that tell us about this rock that is not cut out with human hands, that comes and destroys this statue, which represents the Gentile kingdoms of the earth? That rock coming is Christ. He will return to this earth, and the rock grows to a great mountain. It fills the whole earth. So, this tells us that Jesus is going to set up an earthly, political, visible, physical kingdom on the earth that will displace the Gentile kingdoms over the nation of Israel. In many places, we read about the millennial kingdom, but specifically, we can read about it in Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 6. 5 times over in this passage, we are told that this kingdom will last 1,000 years. 1,000 years, 1,000 years. We will live and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. That 1,000-year reign is referring to this rock, not cut out with human hands, that destroys all the Gentile kingdoms and becomes a great mountain filling the whole earth. In Daniel chapter 7, remember that chapter is parallel with Daniel chapter 2. Daniel says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Verse 14, and there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom is that which shall not be destroyed. So that rock kingdom coming is the kingdom of Christ. Let's finish Daniel chapter 2 and read about Nebuchadnezzar's response. It says, then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and worshipped Daniel, and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. The king answered and said unto Daniel, of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret. Then the king made Daniel a great man, and gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. Then Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat in the gate of the king. Last week, we were comparing Daniel to Joseph, son of Israel. If you'll remember, Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream, and because of his sure interpretation, Pharaoh promoted Joseph to the right-hand man of the throne of Egypt. We see that happening with Daniel as well. Daniel not only recounts Nebuchadnezzar's dream, but he gives him a trusty interpretation. And as a result, Daniel was promoted. He was given many gifts, much honor, just as Nebuchadnezzar had promised. And he was made ruler over the province of Babylon, like Joseph was ruler in Egypt. Nothing happened without Joseph's words. And chief over all the wise men of Babylon. So Daniel is promoted to a place of honor. He becomes the teacher of teachers, the instructor of wise men. And so once again, his influence in these ancient days trickles down to our time of Christmas celebration, when we talk about the Magi coming from the east to recognize the one who had been born King of the Jews. Daniel's influence in that kingdom is timeless. And even his words reach down to us now so that we can have perspective. We can understand how we are oriented on the timeline of human history, so that we can see so much has been fulfilled. Much of that statue has lived its life. There's just a little bit left, and then just around the corner is the rock kingdom. So we have all of that to look forward to. So I appreciate you listening. I hope that you enjoyed this lesson. Feel free to make comments. If you have anything interesting to say, we would love to hear that discussion. And next time we'll talk about Daniel chapter 3, which is also a fascinating study. So thanks for listening. Hope you have a great day.